Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another one of my Gaudium et Spes 22.com podcasts and YouTube channel videos. Today, I'm really pleased to have a real heavy hitter with me today, a sort of internet phenom these days, but also a man of great gravitas in his own right, Gavin Ashendon, who formerly an Anglican priest and a bishop in the Christian Episcopal Church. You'll have to explain to me what exactly that is. And then a convert to Catholicism a few years ago. And so I wanted to have him on the show because he's really an interesting fellow. And so thank you, Gavin, for coming on the show today.
Well, Larry, thank you very much for having me, and very glad to be in conversation with you.
Yes. Now you're English, right? Not Scottish or something more esoteric even than that, right?
Well, I did a DNA test, which was brought to me by my family a few years ago, and I discovered I'm 30% Anglo-Saxon from my father's side, 30% Celtic from my mother's side, and 30% Jewish. So,
Wow.
so that was a
Wow.
surprise.
Yeah, that's quite a
It,
surprise.
It turns out my father was completely Jewish without knowing it. So he had a Jewish mother, and there was a couple of rabbis who came into the country in 1700 from Eastern Europe, and there was a sort of Jewish line. Anyway, they intermarried with my family in the Victorian era, and consequently preserved a level of Jewishness, and passed on their DNA to the progeny
Wow, that's
further
fascinating.
downstream.
That's fascinating. I've resisted doing any such DNA analysis of my own background, mainly because I have such conspiratorial fantasies floating in my head of the government getting a hold of my DNA and doing things with it. But it would be fascinating to see my own. I'm half Polish and a little bit Italian and so on. But anyway,
Splendid.
I didn't come on here to discuss my DNA. I know that. So please, before we go on, before I want you to discuss briefly your conversion story. What is the Christian Episcopal Church in which you were a bishop?
So the Anglican world, I'm just trying to line you up so I look into the camera rather than look shiftily to one side or the other. But now I have the camera and your eyes lined up, so there we go.
Okay, good.
The Anglican world is a very complicated and sophisticated beast. But in America, when the liberal agenda, the progressive Christian agenda, broke in the 1980s, the Anglican Church, which is already theologically and politically a system of different churches, would come together in an alliance under a form of gentle Protestantism, divided under the pressure, and some of them veered towards Catholicism. And one of the ways they veered is that having a question mark put over their orders by Pope Leo the 13th,
Right.
they sought to gain Catholic orders by having both the ordination of priests and the consecration of their bishops added to by Roman Catholic bishops. Now, I won't begin to try and defend the Roman Catholic bishops who ordained or consecrated Anglican clergy. I'm not sure. And you might imagine I strongly disapprove of that now.
Yeah.
But at the time, there was a bishop in Brazil, South America being a place of creative Catholicism, who fell out with the Vatican immediately after the war over the Nazi run into South America.
Right. Right.
And for one reason or another, they got his secretary to smuggle in his resignation papers in the Morning Mail, and without knowing it, he resigned his see. And the Vatican said, "Ha, got you." So he was quite cross about that. And he said, well, these are still my diocese, still my church, still my clergy, not yours. And so he set up the independent Brazilian Apostolic Church. It didn't last very long, and as schism doesn't. But during that time, he consecrated a number of Episcopalian bishops, and they formed what became the Christian Episcopal Church. And the intention of it was quite sensible in some ways. It was put when I realized that the Church of England was going to simply become a form of progressive sub-Christian post-Protestant sect. I know that sounds a bit rude, but I could defend that if asked to. The question was there any kind of Anglicanism that could be rescued, a form of Orthodox Anglicanism with a rooted in Catholic character, but with reformed charisms of some kind. And the people who put this to me said that having Catholic Episcopal orders, which might or might not be accepted by the Vatican tends to allow 4 generations of them if you apply in these rather eccentric circumstances. Longer than 4, and it's too far. That you might then you might provide an ecumenical bridge between conservative Anglicans looking for a home in Rome and Rome itself, a kind of do-it-yourself ordinariate put together with, you can imagine. Well, at the time, this would have been about 2012 when I had these conversations. We had no idea what lay ahead. I mean, what it was quite clear that progressive liberal Protestant Christianity was doomed, and the only question was, how might you rescue people? So if people ask me now, my answer would be, well, just become Roman Catholic. It's so much simpler.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
at the time, that wasn't as clear to me as it should have been. I mean, sometimes it takes a while for fog to clear, and so I would say it took about 7 or 8 years for the fog to clear. And when it did clear, and I realized that what I was trying to do, which was effectively draw together 5 or 6 Anglican constituencies, the absence of a magisterium made the whole process completely fatal. And as I reflected on that, I said, well, there's only one place to get the magisterium, and that's by becoming Catholic properly. So that's what happened.
Yeah. So the question I first asked, which is, what is the Christian Episcopal Church, actually answered the second question, which is kind of give us a little bit of a detail of your segue into the Catholic Church, and you've kind of adequately described that now. So the nub of the issue was the lack of a magisterium in the Christian Episcopal Church, and that you needed to take that step into Rome. So
I think I'd want just for the sake of complexity. I mean, one can answer things as simply as possible, but sometimes with a nod to complexity. I think there are a number of layers, and I mean, some of those layers are to do with spiritual blindness. I think that there is a metaphysical war raged over souls who want to return to Rome. I think it is of such importance to Jesus and Our Lady and the Protestant Reformation, or Deformation as it's been called, is such a wound in the body of Christ that I think the stakes are really quite high. And so returning to Catholicism is not a matter of personal preference, or not a matter of choosing one church which is better than the other. It's a way of being obedient to the will of Christ, as he talks about it in John 17, in a sacrificial way, which has, I think, a great deal at stake in terms of the spiritual struggle, if we're going to talk metaphysically, that we're involved in. And the reason I say that is not because I'm trying to make it a more sophisticated or pretentious process in my own case, but because I'm very surprised at the irrational way in which people, whom I urge Catholic conversion on, object to it. And they don't object to it with clear theological, intellectual, cultural, historical reasons. They object to it with a kind of hysteria. And I've often thought that when one meets irrational hysteria, one hypothesis is one's dealing with the demonic, or with the sort of with the problematic other side of the line. And more, I think this is so, because one can argue the matter theologically very cogently, but people won't have it. And this not having it is not just a matter of pride, though it sometimes is, or obstinacy, or convenience, though it sometimes is. But I think it's much more than that. I think it's part of the spiritual struggle that we're engaged in to try and heal the Western Church under the see of Peter. But there are other arguments too. There's an enormous amount of fake history. I thought myself quite well educated theologically and historically. And it was an enormous surprise to me as I reread English history of the 16th and 17th century to discover that I had been fed disinformation from childhood. And the scope of that disinformation was enormous.
You're familiar then with like Eamon Duffy's book, The Stripping of the Altars?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But Duffy, but I mean, Duffy's only been around for 20 or 30 years in terms of it's a new thing.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, first of all, before Duffy, we had the Oxford movement and the Tractarians saying, again, with disinformation, sadly, saying there's a three-branch theory. There's a very good chance we really are Catholics, or we're growing into Catholics, or the umbilical cord is still there. Actually, when one rereads the history of the Elizabethan persecutions and the extent to which the state went to demonize and execute and persecute priests just for celebrating the Mass, it's presented as if they were national traitors pursuing the interests of Spain or France, but that's only cosmetically true. What was actually happening was it was a vicious and vigorous determination to theologically, spiritually, philosophically crush the idea of the Mass and to kill anyone who tried to promote it. But when you see the extent to which the state went to do that, including fines for not turning up at the Anglican parish church, equivalent to a year's income every time you didn't do it.
Yeah.
The vigor and the ruthlessness, the murderousness, and the utter fundamentalist determination to wipe out Catholicism, and to do it not only politically but liturgically as an act of the state. You cannot, as Pope Leo pointed out, you cannot take those sort of 150 brutalized years and say there is some form of theological, spiritual, liturgical bridge that gets you from one end to the other. What happened was that further down the line, a degree of revisionist nostalgia allowed Anglicans to posit some form of continuity that is, in fact, historically completely illegitimate. But it's a nice story and rather comforting until you look at the facts.
And along those lines, why do you suppose? And I want to come back to this line a bit. I don't want to take us too far off a tangent, but myself, I'm a huge fan of C.S. Lewis, and I've always wondered, a man of his erudition who clearly understood the history that you've just outlined, what caused him not to cross the Tiber, do you think?
Well, so that's extremely interesting, and I would say two things: the devil and Irish Protestantism. So I've explained why I think the devil is at work. I mean, he was certainly at work for me. Just in brackets for another 30 seconds.
Yeah.
I remember being astonished at my instinctive aggression against Our Lady. I was quite well read theologically, but when I was invited to pray the Rosary, I found myself dealing with something like almost like a sort of indigestion. I can't, I won't, I'm not going to. It's not rational, it's not theological, and if it's spiritual, it's from the other side. And I think, first of all, therefore, one mustn't, I suggest that people don't undermine the degree of spiritual myopia that I think the spiritual struggle imposes. But as well as that, Lewis came from a very Protestant family in the most Protestant part of the United Kingdom, Belfast.
Yeah.
And I think for cultural reasons, for reasons of propaganda, we're all brainwashed a little bit by our culture. I think it was simply impossible for him to take that step. And it's worse than that. There's a degree of racism and social snobbery in England. Catholics were Irish, Italians, Poles, foreigners that English people have been trained to look down on for generations. They were the migrants, the workers, the lower class, the sub-intellectuals. They were the people who weren't clever enough or sophisticated enough to enjoy the benefits. I'm speaking ironically and in parentheses, inverted commas. I can't tell you how difficult it is. It still is for a middle-class English person to junk what small elements of English national pride remain and become a Catholic. You become a foreigner. Now, in one sense, that's perfectly right. You are a foreigner in that you belong to the kingdom of heaven. Chesterton was quite good on that. But in another sense, intertwined with all of that is a degree of English civic cultural identity. And again, it's Catholics are the other. They're not us. They're outside the establishment. They couldn't go to Oxford and Cambridge. They couldn't hold places in the professions. The only Catholics who had any respect at all, and that not much, were a few very rich ancient families who were recusants. So it's a big cultural thing.
Oh, I think that really puts the finger on something really, really, I think, true about Lewis. So, for example, I was always struck by his almost complete lack of attention to Cardinal Newman. you find almost nothing in Lewis's writings about Newman. A little here and there, but not to the extent that one would expect of a churchman of Newman's intellectual stature in the British tradition, that Lewis would have been familiar with. But anyway, I want to get back to what you were talking. The main, the sort of notion that the history that has been fed a lot of bad history about the nature of the English Reformation under Henry VIII and on through Elizabeth, which kind of presented to the world and to the British subjects, and then later on to almost everybody, this narrative that Catholicism was really rather easily tossed off by the British people themselves, that the British people greeted this Anglican revolution with a great sigh of relief. Finally, we're free of Rome. And so, but the truth is exactly the opposite, that this was kind of imposed on the British people and they didn't want it.
Very much so. And there are examples of that, like the Pilgrimage of Grace, and the fact that there were parts of the country that were profoundly Catholic and very devoted. But most of the evidence is due to the extent to which the state simply went out of its way, both to rewrite history and to be immensely punitive. I think one of the issues was that they were absolutely determined not to give the monastic lands back, not to give the money back. And the moment you entered, I mean, it ought to be a current discussion still, because I'm about to go on the BBC on Sunday and talk about how the Catholic cathedrals can be saved from falling in disrepair under their Anglican hosts who have no people to go to them. And well, one of the reasons is that the Anglican Church commissioners sit on about £5 billion of assets. That's Catholic money. That's the historic money that they gathered together when they raped and robbed the monasteries. Now, you could make a very good case historically and morally, politically, it won't go anywhere. But you could make a case for saying, give the cathedrals back to the Catholics and give us £5 billion to run them, which was the money you took from us in the first place. Now, that's obviously a form of romantic idealism that's wholly impractical, and it's only designed to annoy people. But historically, it's true. Historically, that's the case. They're Catholic buildings conceived with Catholic imagination. The reason the Anglicans are filling them with entertainment centers like helter-skelters and mini golf courses and gin clubs and adult film evenings is because they have no sense of the Mass, no sense of the presence of the Blessed Sacrament, and they are simply entertainment centers of a religious or social kind.
I've seen that. It's sad. It's sad. I'm a Benedictine oblate, and the patron saint that I chose when I professed to be a Benedict oblate was Saint John Robert, who was a Benedictine, an English Benedictine who fled England under the persecutions, went to France. His conscience got the better part of him. But the point is, there are all these Catholics in England begging him to come back and begging others like him to come back because they wanted the Mass. So he did go back. He said the Mass, was discovered and was executed, a martyr to the faith. So this is a history that you just don't read very much about at all these days.
You don't, and I mean, every time I go through London on my bicycle, if I'm anywhere near Marble Arch, I stop at Tyburn, and there on the northwest corner. I'm a Londoner. I was born in London. I roughly knew Marble Arch was where Tyburn was, sort of. I didn't know there was a plaque set into the sidewalk in memory of them, nor did I know there was a convent where perpetual adoration is practiced on behalf of the martyrs. The real Catholic history of England has been suppressed for a very good reason, because I think the moment you open it up, you raise questions of the establishment and of the behavior of the state, and of the comparison between Catholic and Anglican truth as expressions of the church that cause a great deal of trouble when you look at them.
Absolutely. And that's a story that needs to be told, I think, more and more. But the reason why I chose John Robert is because, and then we can segue into the next topic, which is that even though I'm a cradle Catholic, I do attend an Anglican Ordinariate parish in Scranton, Pennsylvania. It took some adjusting. My pastor, Father Eric Bergman, I don't know if you know Father Eric Bergman, but Father Bergman has 10 kids. So it did take a little adjustment after Mass to see little ones tugging at the chasuble of my pastor saying, Daddy, Daddy, this, that, and the other thing. But it's been altogether refreshing in many, many ways. And we can talk about perhaps a married clergy or non-married clergy. and I'm open to the topic one way or the other. I just know I love Father Bergman. Anyway, the point is, I want to talk about the liturgy. I mean, what drew me to this parish wasn't that I don't consider the Novus Ordo of the Catholic Church to be this demonic Freemason construction out of the fantasies of Bugnini and so on. Although I do believe that there are deficiencies in the Novus Ordo, big ones, and that there needed to be a reform of the reform. And so therefore, I consider what Pope Benedict did in creating the Anglican Ordinariate to be an absolutely genius gesture on his part. Because, and then you can comment on this, from my point of view, the Anglican Ordinariate liturgy approximates very closely what I think the Council Fathers at Vatican II sort of had in mind with regard to reforming the old Tridentine Mass. What's say? First off, are you a member of the Ordinariate? And then what do you think of the Ordinariate liturgy?
Well, there's a history there. When I became a Catholic, it was partly at the invitation of my Catholic diocesan bishop, who wanted to involve me, who was planning to build a seminary in his diocese for traditionalists. This is before the events that this is before 2020, and that didn't happen. I asked to transfer to the Ordinariate to be ordained a Catholic priest, and discovered that that the price was going to be media silence. And as I thought God had given me, because it was certainly no act of mine. I had an audience.
I want to interrupt you. I had a suspicion that this was the case, which is why I asked you this question. I hope I haven't opened up a landmine field for you, but go ahead.
No, because I think I sympathize with the Ordinariate. I mean, my papers got lost twice in the course of the application. They went to Vietnam instead of Rome, reasons we don't understand. So there's elements of humor in it. I didn't find it funny at the time, but now I do. I think I see the hand of God in it. But if we go back not to my bleating about my life, but given the pressure from Rome, of course the Ordinariate would be concerned about priests speaking out, and we're seeing priests cancelled every month. So they weren't wrong in their anxiety, and I don't think I was wrong in saying that I can be more used to the Catholic Church as a proponent of its truth and its claims as a layman than I could with the great privilege, which I would have loved, of celebrating Mass. But we go back to the Ordinariate as a conception, despite the that friction. I think it's the most wonderful idea, and I agree with you completely. I go back one step further and say, well, although I've been rude about Anglicanism and Protestantism and the state, the Holy Spirit is very generous, even to schismatics. And one of the things that happened at the Reformation was charisms that should have belonged to the Petrine Church were divided and split into different areas. Now, they were all agents of renewal, and they should have found their way back into the church. And the great tragedy of not healing the Reformation is that charisms that were very precious, very powerful, remain outside the Petrine Church when they really belong inside. And so, you get, for example, there were three things Anglicans were very good at. They were very good at hymns, they were very good at liturgy, they were very good at pastoral care. The Catholic Church is not always good at hymns. It's not always good at liturgy, looking at the Novus Ordo. I'm afraid it's not very good at pastoral care sometimes. So, but why should not these three charisms find their way back home? And in the Ordinariate, they do find their way back home. The liturgy that Cranmer, Cranmer was he's presented as a hero to Anglicans. He's a much more complex character than that, a wounded and complex character, but he was an absolute genius. And the English language, again, I'm somebody who doesn't see the Middle Ages as a period between two other attractive periods of history. I think I see it as the absolute height of human achievement in terms of music and architecture, philosophy, and sanctity, the holiness of people in the West, often women in the 14th and 15th centuries, was notable and profound and rich. But back to the Ordinariate, the liturgy is very, very beautiful, and to make good what Cranmer made bad, which is the which is the theology which he bastardized, and with a few tweaks of nouns, verbs, and sentence structure to keep the genius of his poetry and the incredibly beautiful cadence of English language that stretches from Shakespeare to Cranmer. Again, one of the most beautiful languages, both in rhythm and richness of vocabulary and creative inventiveness, and to use that to worship God. It's like the difference between using I don't know, some not very competent songster and Mozart. You'd want to use Mozart musically to praise the Lord. So I think the Ordinariate is an absolute act of creative genius. I fear that politically it may not succeed in the way it ought to succeed, but then church politics have always been a bloody and complicated business, and hopefully it will outlast the present regime, and the generosity and prophetic insight that Pope Benedict brought to the church may still find that the seed he planted flowering.
I do take some consolation in the fact that Pope Francis, though he has moved against the traditional Catholic Latin Mass, has pretty much left the Ordinariate alone, although I suspect that he probably would not have created such a thing on his own initiative had he been the Pope at the time. But nevertheless, I do take consolation in the fact that he hasn't moved against it. But I do believe that one of the reasons is that the Ordinariate parishes did not become hotbeds of opposition to his papacy in the same way that various traditional Latin Mass parishes did. And I think that had a role to play in it. So you're actually, in the eyes of Rome, then you're perhaps an illicitly but a validly consecrated bishop, correct?
I think I probably am. Yes, I mean, I was invited by my diocesan bishop to test the validity of my consecration, but told it would take 7 years. Well, I'm about to turn 70. Time is short.
Yes.
I wasn't sure that 7 years waiting for Rome to give me a fancy ecclesial prefix was quite worth it. So I invited them not to pursue it. But I am slightly ontologically confused. I suspect my orders are valid, but they're not operable. So this wouldn't be the first time that people have accused me of schizophrenia. So I just accept the divisions of personality and press on with.
I share in a minuscule way with that metaphysical confusion, because I'm actually a laicized deacon. I was
right.
3 months. I was 3 months away from ordination to the priesthood and decided, no, not going to do that. So I did get. So I have somewhat of that same. But the reason why I ask you the question does pertain to liturgy, which is you therefore are not a functioning priest in the Catholic Church, and therefore you do not say a mass in any public way, or probably even privately. So what then is your experience of Catholic liturgy as a lay person out there in the pews?
So I don't say a mass publicly. I don't say it privately. I've been very tempted to say it privately.
I would too. I would be too, actually. So kudos to you for resisting that temptation. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, I have resisted it, apart from the fact that occasionally I found myself concelebrating from the back of the church under my breath, which is the closest I'll allow it's too far already, and I apologize, and it's a sin, and I'm sorry, and I try not to do it. But every so often the words spring out, and but anyway, so that lacuna aside,
so my broader question is, what do you think of the current state of the Catholic liturgy, and what should we do about it? That's kind of what I'm leading up to here.
Well, it's substandard. I mean, the Novus Ordo is substandard. It's substandard in exactly the same way that the Anglican equivalent liturgy is substandard. The Anglican is worse substandard. It throws in all kinds of ambiguities at the epiclesis and elsewhere. But it's awful. The Lord be with you, and also with you. I mean, it's there's a kind of clumsiness to it. There's no language, but in fact, the Anglicans have presented the worst. Exactly the opposite. A non-language that nobody likes, with no beauty to it. But the Catholics are not far off it with the Novus Ordo. I think it's redeemed by the fact that if you're saying the Agnus Dei or the Sanctus, it is the Agnus Dei, it is the Sanctus. But I mean, if somebody asked me to sit down and say what could be done, and it wasn't merely a movement towards the Latin Mass, of which I'm deeply fond. And all my instincts are the Latin Mass is the Latin Mass, and everything else simply derives from it and back ad fontes. But if we weren't going to do that, then I would look. I would lament the fact that the English language, both English and American, is really pretty functional at the moment. It's not very beautiful. There was a moment when particularly in translating one of the reasons why, please forgive me going off a tangent, but I'll try and come back. One of the reasons why I moved towards Ordinariate was I was saying the Psalms in the daily office, and I have a little bit of Hebrew, and I was saying, Lord, these are trash. Who are the idiots who translated? This is just dreadful. The translation is dreadful and the English is dreadful. I don't want to spend my next 20 years before I come to stand before you bastardizing the Psalms like this. What have I given up? Because actually there's some very good Anglican translations. And that was when I thought, well, I could go back to Coverdale. I could go back to the poetic beauty of the. I mean, they made a few mistakes in Hebrew in the 16th century, but so that was when the idea of moving towards Ordinariate first took root. But liturgically, we could make it more beautiful. We could make it less incompetently immanent. I mean, in terms of one of the things Vatican II did was to make concessions to the culture, to make it seem more accessible to the ordinary person. But I don't think the accessibility is a job of the Holy Spirit. If we read St. Paul, it's not the job of incompetent liturgists.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. As soon as you start to tailor it to what you think are the competencies of this or that generation, it's out of date within 20 years.
Of course it is. Exactly so. And there is a very, what's the word? Sophisticated, subtle, challenging task of balancing transcendence and immanence in all liturgy. And it's no easy business, but when you failed. And at the moment liturgically, the Catholic Church has failed in that balance. Now, again, the Holy Spirit makes good our deficiencies with the miracle of the Mass and the utterly extraordinary transcendence of the fusion of transcendence and immanence in the very act of receiving our Lord through the bread in our bodies. But we could do better to build a framework that was more honoring to that profound transaction of the two things.
I agree with you. How does one do that? And I think this was the hesitancy of Pope Benedict. People say, man, he was the Pope most competent of all modern popes to truly reform the liturgy in a proper direction. Why didn't he do it? And he actually hinted at it one time, and I think this is a real problem, to just come in and say, okay, we had the Novus Ordo. It was a big flaw, a big don't. We're going to really radically change this thing now back to something more in tune with the tradition. How does that then avoid just the deeper implication that the liturgy is this utterly plastic thing that we can just toss around like a beach ball at the shore, willy-nilly based on who is Pope at the time? I think this is what Pope Benedict really feared.
I think that's probably right. Well, actually, the Anglicans had a good idea in the turn of the 20th century when they were revising both their hymnal and their liturgy. For their hymnal, they got Vaughan Williams, one of the most competent and beautiful of English composers, and for the liturgy and the translation of the Psalms, they had people like T.S. Eliot. So, I mean, I think one of the things I would do is to say, the problem with professional translators is, they're quite good linguistically at the act of translation, but they may be dreadful wordsmiths. So you want poets and dramatists. You want people who have got a feeling for cadence and rhythm and the multi-layeredness of words, and you put them in the same room with the experts, and you say, okay, now let's see if together we can bring your skills together. But I mean, there were no poets anywhere near any liturgical thing I've been involved with.
No,
It was
even the reform of the translation of the Novus Ordo liturgy to make it conform more closely to the Latin that Pope Benedict did, a move which I applaud. Nevertheless, even from my point of view, as you read some of the prayers, they're extremely convoluted translations that don't make for good English in very many circumstances.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm afraid, this is the point where we find a conflict. This is a conflict every child translating Latin, Latin to English or French to English finds in their results. How do you manage accuracy with beauty, or how do you manage technical accuracy of matching the words with artistic or fluent accuracy? And it's an almost an alchemical process. And I think you need people with gifts to do that. And very often, the people best at the languages are not the right people to create the poetry of the translation.
Well, I couldn't agree with that more. And I hope that at age 65, I hope I live to see the day, maybe under a future papacy, in which a real reform of the Catholic liturgy takes place. Because I think there's instead of a synod on synodality or a synod on this, that, or the, maybe we should have had a synod on liturgy, although I cringe to think what the product of that might be. But that then leads into the next segment of this talk. And I don't know how long you have, but I'm so happy that you're here, which is this. I mean, you converted to Catholicism for all the reasons that you talked about. No need to rehearse those again. What then is your reaction to the fact that you're in the Catholic Church now and you have a pope, let's just say, is less than what your ideal might be for what the occupant of the chair of Peter might be? So what are your thoughts? I mean, what do you, as a former Anglican who came to the Catholic Church seeking, in a sense, the rock of Petrine authority, what do you think now of the church? What's your take on this papacy, and where do we go from here?
Oh, so two questions. One is how do I react, and then
exactly.
my analysis. So my reaction, of course, is complaint and self-pity. Lord, could I not have converted under JP2, please? I see John Paul II singing the Lord's Prayer in Latin, and I say, that's my kind of pope. Why did I not get there on time?
Pater noster,
exactly. So this wonderful masculine
Baratos.
musical.
Exactly.
Great. So I complain, and then, but of course, if one is to try to understand what's going on in the world at the moment and the church at the moment, I get really fed up with people saying, ha, 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 you jumped from the frying pan into the fire, you silly man. Didn't you know it was going to be just as bad? And the answer was, well, of course I did. I've known perfectly well. I mean, one of the things I did in the 1980s was I smuggled Bibles into both the Soviet Union and into Czechoslovakia. In Czechoslovakia, the communists banned all ordinations, so the Catholic Church was underground, but it had no access to any books. I was one of the people who smuggled books in for Catholic ordinands in underground seminaries. I got caught by the KGB in Russia and by the secret police in Prague and interrogated. They were very unpleasant to me, but they gave me a very strong sense of what the issues were between communism and Christianity. And one of the greatest shocks of my life was round about the year 2000, when I had a profound, almost mystical sense that communism was back. And I thought how it was this was not very odd to people, but perhaps the very oddness might give it legitimacy. It was a taste in my mouth. I tasted the rust of communism, almost like very hard to explain, but I said, Lord, it's back. How could it be back? Fukuyama in '89 said, it's the end of all that kind of thing. And then I was a professor of the psychology of religion at the most radical left-wing university in the UK. I began to do some reading and talking to my colleagues. I discovered the Frankfurt School, which I'd never heard of, didn't know about.
Horkheimer, Adorno, right?
Absolutely. And then I sat down and I said, okay, so that's it. That's the stuff that's percolating through the faculty doors that and it was perfectly clear to me, even in the year 2000, that it was going to impact freedom of speech and freedom of thought. So that's how it's coming back. So I began to talk about that and write about that. And, people said, you're mad, you're stupid, you're neurotic, whatever. And one of the things that I saw really quite clearly was that both the stalking horse is being used by this absolutist totalitarian revamp of cultural, well, we call it cultural Marxism, was going to use feminism and sexuality as its stalking horses. And what we were being presented with was not the case, and the implications would be enormously problematic, and they would lead to a degree of totalitarian control. And that's exactly what's happened, and is happening. Well, Pope Francis, well, I don't understand him, of course. I see what he's doing. I mean, what he's doing is he's acting as an agent for exactly the cultural, the proponents of the cultural struggle that we're with, and so it's extremely unpleasant. Occasionally, I think to myself, and I'm sorry to say this, but there's some strong parallels with the ministry of Judas amongst the apostles. So, our Lord has 12 apostles, 8% of them, or whatever a 12th is, are traitors to the cause. They've willfully, or they have, maybe willfully misunderstood. Judas has quite clearly got a more politicized, view of what the messianic quest is, and in the end, he betrays Christ to force Jesus to jump, he hopes, his way, we think. There's something, I'm afraid, I'm sorry to say, that in the values that the present Pope, there's something of the spirituality of Judas at work, because why the chaos? Why the attack on people who are most faithful? Why the attack on the guardians of the profoundest parts of the tradition? Why the misunderstandings? Why the ambiguity, although I probably said that. And so one could speak theologically or pneumatically, but the enemy is clearly inside the gates. And so,
I think the Marxist analogy is an interesting one. I was in Rome this past summer, and it happened to coincide with the Vatican, which cost them 850,000 euro, hosting the world meeting of the Fraternity of Human Family, or something solid. Yeah. And I remember walking up and down the Via della Conciliazione, they're the big main venue, leaving Rome, and all of these tents were set up. They were clearly expecting thousands and thousands of people to show, all these vendors. But what I noticed, there were all kinds of slogans on banners that said solidarity, inclusion, fraternity. There was not a single banner anywhere that had the name Jesus Christ. Not once, not anywhere. And then, of course, there was the massive embarrassment of the fact that nobody showed up, even in a summer when Rome was completely overrun with tourists in a way that I've never seen before. So it opens up like a dual prong question here with regard to your very strong sort of insinuation. There's a sort of a sort of Judas element here. Number one, how conscious do you think Pope Francis is that he's actually deliberately doing something here, sidling up to a kind of humanitarian, utopian, sort of almost Marxist vision of things? Is he just naive, or is this deliberate? And the second thing would be, will it be successful? I mean, I just don't see how it can possibly even remotely be attractive to most people in the Catholic pews. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, these are very profound questions, and I'm not sure I'm up to the answers, but I'll try. In terms of the first one, to some extent, I was Pope Francis. I went. What I mean by that is, I inhabited some of the theological instincts I see him acting out. And the reason I did that was because I became a Jungian. I became a Jungian because, for a number of reasons, partly because in the university context, I needed somebody to act as a foil to Freud, and Freud configured all the minds of my colleagues as faculty members. And Jung appeared to me to be just the ally I needed. And this happened to be the moment when Jungian ideas were just about to break into Western culture and like a tidal wave. And there were some very real advantages about being a Jungian. I had, when I first converted as an evangelical Protestant, some fairly nasty experiences with evil. So although I've spoken about evil in our conversation so far, I haven't done it lightly or with a kind of reflex closed mind that you find in some forms of fundamentalist presentation of the issues. I fled from evil. I found the difficulty of discerning the difference between evil and mental illness too difficult as a young man and a young Anglican priest. And I'm afraid it wasn't exactly cowardice, but it was, I can't fight this. I'm not big enough to manage this. I'm not, but if I take the psychological route, I can bring some good out of it, because Jung offers a great deal of virtue. But what I didn't realize, a bit like Marxism itself, is that if you eat the bait, there's poison in it. And so the poison in Jung is the complete refusal to make a distinction between metaphysical good and metaphysical evil. So he uses instead the notion of light and shadow, which on a continuum, one's the inversion of the other. You bring them together.
Yin and yang, all that.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, although there are times and there are places both in psychology and in philosophy where there's scope for elements of that, as a philosophy of life, it's profoundly dangerous, because it entirely blinds you to the reality of the spiritual struggle between good and evil. Something that Lewis in particular was brilliant at this. In fact, Lewis had his own fight with this, and he saw the fight in terms of who was the mystic in the 18th century? I'm getting the when I forget people's names. Wait a moment, it was William Blake.
Oh, William Blake.
So William Blake produced this Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Lewis, which was very influential philosophically in English intellectual circles, Lewis was outraged at this and decided this had to be taken on. And so he wrote the book, The Great Divorce, nothing to do with marriage, everything to do with the divorce of heaven and hell.
Right.
In order to bring back to his readers, and particularly his Christian readers, the reality of the struggle for salvation, that heaven and hell were real. Luckily, he believed in purgatory too, that the angels and the demons were real, that the struggle for salvation took place in this context, and that Blake and Jung becomes a kind of disciple of Blake, and as does Pope Francis, in fact, in the sense that they've got the same worldview. Well, when I found myself a Jungian, certain consequences followed. Having bought into the presuppositions, you then take a view of sexuality which is entirely integralist. You look at homosexuality and mix it with a bit of pastoral care and a bit of socialism, and you poor outsiders and a bit of Jungian. Well, there is no good or evil. We need to find a conflation and integration, and you suddenly become a passionate pro-gay activist who believes that you're doing good. And so I spent about 15 years in that mindset, and this is it's sorry, but the thing that broke me out of it was that I got attacked by the devil. I had some demonic episodes where I phoned up a friend of mine who was a Catholic diocesan exorcist. His name was, and I said, I'm either going mad or the devil's real and he's making a serious job of trying to attack me. And he was a marvelous man. He said, I'm sorry, dear boy, it's real. What do I do? And he said, nothing, pray the rosary, just pray the rosary. And I said, well, I can't quite bring myself to, well, he said, he's a Yorkshireman. He said, oh, lad, he said, got to choose between Our Lady and going to hell. Which is it going to be? So I began to pray the rosary, and it had an immediate effect. I was woken up in the middle of the night, 3 nights running, with an aspect of hell breaking into my bedroom and my sleep. So I went without sleep, and hell does what it always does, which is to bring, has 2 particular phenomena. It says, first of all, there is no hope, and secondly, it says it's your fault. And that's how you know it's hell rather than a nervous breakdown. Right. And also it kind of, it just happens at a moment in time. Nervous breakdowns you can see coming weeks, months, years off. But when I picked up the rosary and came out the other side, having discovered the rosary worked in an extraordinary way, I had to revisit everything. I went looking at the apparitions to understand Our Lady better. I came across Garabondal, Zaitun, and I very quickly came to the point where I believed in the apparitions and developed a relationship with Our Lady, and then began to reject, of course, the whole Jungian mindset. So this is a long segue about Pope Francis. So let me get back there.
Take your time.
I understand. I understand. I mean, somewhere along the line, he swallowed the presuppositions I swallowed too, and he's making all the kind of Jungian inclusive, semi-Marxist, semi-political, semi-psychological, therapeutic noises, which you then they then wrap it up like liberation theology did in certain aspects of the gospel, compassion, misunderstanding the Magnificat. I would say also that one of the great theological perversions is misunderstanding the Beatitudes and the prophetic language of the Old Testament, which is almost always not about economic poverty. It's about spiritual poverty. As it happens, economic and spiritual poverty are never disconnected, but that isn't the point. The point is that in the Beatitudes, particularly in the Magnificat also, and right the way through the prophets, poverty is a spiritual metaphysical construct. Yes. And what our society has done, not understanding metaphysics, is to read it as an economic textbook. And again, that's what we're getting in the Vatican at the moment too. But it all stems from these presuppositions. So I look at Pope Francis and I think, well, okay, I understand how you got there. And I'm sorry the devil hasn't attacked you and shocked you into repentance like he shocked me. But you're profoundly mistaken. And this is of enormous danger to the church. To what extent is he morally culpable? Only the Lord knows. I have no idea. But I know what he's doing. I know why he's doing it. I don't know how he came to do it. But I'm very sorry indeed that within the church, there aren't the voices with sufficiently gifted, astute discernment to say, we see what you're doing. It's just wrong. And here's why it's wrong. Here's an interpretation of the Gospels. Let's look at a bit of Greek and Hebrew philosophy and theology. Let's look at the history of the church. Let's look at the history of the 20th century. Let's look at our great competitors, these parasites that are slicking into Christianity, particularly the whole therapeutic jargon stuff and Marxism. Now let's peel them away. We don't have to swallow this stuff. We are, I don't think we're cleverer than that, but that's slightly hubristic. We are better informed and more spiritually attuned than that. My astonishment is that within our culture, so many people in my generation just drunk the Kool-Aid, and unlike me, they weren't lucky enough to have some kind of car crash that made them stop and think twice. Only by stopping and thinking twice can you find metanoia and begin to repent. So I understand it, and I but ultimately I think it's a metaphysical struggle. I think this is the deceit of the devil, and only being on our knees and repenting and invoking Our Lady and the saints and the power of the Mass will unglue this thing. There's a wonderful Lewis knew about this. In one of his Narnia books, his children's books, I think it's A Silver Chair. He has the Lady of the Green Kirtle. She's a witch. One of the things she does is to put some green incense, fumigation stuff on the fire, and as the children breathe it in, it brings amnesia. And they're saved by a creature called Puddleglum, I think, who sees what's happening, and risking burning his feet to pieces, he stomps on the fire and he puts out this aroma of forgetfulness, and the children begin to recover their memory. It's a very powerful image of what's happening in the 21st century. We have this kind of aroma of forgetfulness of the tradition and of mysticism and of sanctity, and we have forgotten. And in that forgetfulness, the Lady of the Green Kirtle has this propaganda. There is no God. There is no outside. There is no truth. There is no beauty.
Yeah. Yeah, and along those lines, to go back to you, I think your analysis of the Jungian angle here is brilliant, and there could also possibly be these pantheistic undertones, right? Because Jung, I mean, you going once again back to Lewis. Lewis had in Mere Christianity talked about critique the notion of the God who is beyond the moral categories of good and evil. In other words, that good and evil are simply light and shadow, yin and yang, the reconciliation of opposites, and up one day, down the next, and this is just the great washing machine of existence, and it all comes out in the end. And there's an element, I think, of that in Jungian analysis of our spiritual side. And one sees, therefore, I'm not going to say that Pope Francis is a straight up pantheist. I don't think that. But you also see his exaggerated emphasis on environmentalism as well. in connection, almost as if our devotion to the natural environment in which we live is some sort of ultimacy. It takes on an importance in this papacy that seems a bit outsized to me.
Yes, there are no new heresies. They're always the same. The environmental heresy is the same thing that the prophets were dealing with when they were confronting the Canaanite high places. If you don't believe in God the Father as the creator and the earth given to us for stewardship, then, as Lewis pointed out, the fact is that masculinity and femininity are theologically very, very highly charged indeed. And if you don't control them, they'll control you. Now, Revelation allows us to control them. But if you don't control them, then there is a kind of default instinct in humanity to placate Mother Earth because she feeds us, we live on the teat, so to speak. Everything we eat comes from her. We piss her off. We annoy her. We desecrate her. We might starve. And so there is an instinctive natural religion, also pantheistic thing, but also it's this Earth Mother Sky Father conflict. So Christendom won that, but before that, pantheism won it, and polytheism won it. And so, again, because of the amnesia, we've forgotten why we won it and why it was important. And so we're slipping back into the whole Gaia thing, which is not just ecology; it's also the religion of the feminine and the replacement of the creator with creation, which is such a theological.
Yes, it was Arnold Toynbee, I believe, who pointed out that in animistic religions, the practitioners thereof understood quite well that nature is both mother and monster. And yet it seems like so many of the nature spiritualities of today have forgotten the monster aspect, that nature doesn't give a hoot, doesn't give a damn about us.
It's a great deal.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, sorry, you froze and I didn't hear you continue. I'm sorry to talk across you. Well, you're right. And also the fact that priestesses abound, partly because in their femininity, they have a more congruent representation of Mother Earth and fertility. But of course, what we're required to have and what we're given in the Judeo-Christian revelation is a balance, but it's not a symmetrically equivalent balance. The quest for symmetry is a great mistake, in the same way that there's no symmetry between Jesus and Mary. There's no real symmetry between Adam and Eve, but there's a right ordering of a complementary relationship. But once again, there are no theologians talking about the complementary balance of masculinity and femininity, the implications of creator and creation, the way in which this works itself out in human sexual and conceptual matters. But we've forgotten our theology and we've misunderstood the scriptures.
Very much so. And that leads quite naturally into, you just recently had an article that I posted everywhere that I post things. I believe it was in the Catholic Herald. I can't remember now. It was and I think it was the best analysis, and I said so publicly, of Cardinal Fernandez's both Fiducia Supplicans, but then also the later revelation of his adolescent musings on sexuality. That book in 1998 came out. And I just wanted to publicly say that I thought that your analysis hit it out of the ballpark, because so much of the analysis was either focusing on the fact that it was titillating or quasi soft porn, and it sort of misses the point, or that, oh, this is just theology of the body from John Paul II on steroids or whatever. You seem to get right to the heart of it. So maybe why don't you talk to my viewers a little bit about what you said in that article that I think was just brilliant.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you. But in a sense, God goes before everything. As it happens, my doctoral work was on an English theologian who was a friend of C.S. Lewis, one of the Inklings, called Charles Williams. Yes. One of the very interesting things about Charles Williams was he was a part of a Neo-Rosicrucian group. This Neo-Rosicrucian group was born out of something called the Golden Dawn. The Golden Dawn, for people who want to know, was an extraordinary group of English thinkers and writers in the late 19th century who were interested in a revamping of mysticism and and contained on a plane black magicians like Aleister Crowley at one end. We won't talk about him. You either know about him or you don't. And at the other end, some Christians who are essentially interested in a reinvigoration of the mystical life. But they've all found themselves in one group. And fascinatingly, right in the middle was W.B. Yeats, who was kind of looking both ways at the same time. And one of the things I had to do was I instinctively, I was fairly sure that my man was not an occultist, although he'd clearly been in the ballpark and had got, he'd been tainted by it and too close to it for comfort. But nonetheless, he'd made his way into authentic Orthodox Christianity. And one of the things I was trying to do, particularly against evangelicals, was to say, this man is an authentic Christian. Lewis described him as the most holy man he'd ever met. Lewis wasn't easily fooled.
Right.
But this required me to get to know not only about this 19th century group, but also to become fairly familiar with esotericism and alchemy in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. And so where the roots were to be found. So I know a bit about it. And when I saw that Cardinal Fernandez was essentially practicing sex magic, I said, well, I know what sex magic is. I'm sorry if other people don't, but it's this. and in fact, I've written a subsequent article which come out, which I'm much more proud of, which is that if I can just not boast about it, but I mean,
it has come out. It has come out.
No, it hasn't come out yet.
Oh, okay.
It's coming out in the print edition, and maybe they'll put it out on the internet after that. But my great lament is, if you're going to do magic, you should have done music magic, not sex magic, because if you want to find something that acts instrumentally to make God present of the different forms of human experience, you could legitimately make that mistake with music. And in fact, one of the problems the church has is it becomes idolatrous about music. Very few church musicians are practicing Christians. They're seduced by music itself as an art form. And music is a very worthy art form to seduce you. If you're going to give way to an idolatry, you've got a worthy opponent in music to have been beaten by. That doesn't mean we should give way, but when you listen to Mozart above all, but Palestrina, heaven becomes as close to being present as being present might be, but nonetheless, it still does not instrumentalize the divine presence. The Mass does, music doesn't. How this cardinal can have chosen orgasmic sex instead of Mozart? I mean, what low classness is this? And so I'm kind of deeply aesthetically offended that he should go into the realm of sex magic. And I have to say, it can only be, if in an imaginary world where I was his confessor, I would say, you've been dabbling in things. They've got you. This thing's got its hooks into you, hasn't it? You wouldn't be doing this if it hadn't got it. When did it get its hooks into you? What haven't you repented of? We then have to talk about some things that led to him writing about a theology of kissing with far too many moustaches for comfort. And then the way in which this ridiculous and very dangerous, wholly improper philosophical book. But the important thing is not to lambast him for having burnt his fingers in some form of the incompetence of discipleship. We've all had to go to the confession, but it's to say he clearly hasn't repented. He hasn't noticed it's got its hooks into him. And it has a form of continuation in his further theological writings. And the reason why Amoris Laetitia is causing such trouble is because he's smuggled sex magic into it, or rather, to put it more in a clearer way, that's too clumsy a phrase. The way in which his weakness for sex magic has continued to develop theologically has led to an ambiguity about sexual romantic relations,
right,
that then distorts the very careful and difficult theology of sexuality within Christianity. I mean, we do have trouble. I mean, John Paul II's theology of the body is, of course, magnificent. But, the Catholic today, for example, that people say to me, well, how can you become a Catholic? Look what it does to sex. And I say, if when I was in the 1960s and 70s, I thought that too. But now look what's happened to sex. Sex has become the most addictive and commercially powerful thing in a way that is wrecking marriages, destroying men's brains, making it impossible for teenagers to date each other, causing erectile dysfunction, and this wave of addiction has swept the Western world. And you want to tell the Catholic Church, which is the only public body that's ever not fallen from it, that its self-defense was exaggerated? It was not exaggerated. I mean, this might lead us into celibacy and priests again, but celibacy and the whole enormous importance of humanae vitae in keeping a barrier between sex and recreation, making it sex for procreation only. Only the Catholic Church did this. It's the only philosophical movement to have the capacity, the insight, and the deep-rootedness to take on board, before it got to us, this terrible, terrible addiction.
Yeah, the Anglicans waved the white flag. What was it, 1929?
Yeah, very early.
At the Lambeth Conference, where they said, it's an instructive too about how these things go. Because if you look at the Anglican decision, it was, well, under certain very limited circumstances and for only very good reasons, we will allow Anglican couples to practice some sort of contraception, so long as this does not take deep root, blah, 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 blah. And of course, within a few short years, it's like, well,
it's just situation ethics. I mean, that's, situation ethics is practiced by people who don't understand either that moral is absolute, or how the moral rules we have connect with the absolute. And the thing is, Catholic theology, Catholic ethical theology, it does that. Now, I don't want to be rude to people, because it took me to the end of my life to discover the Catholics are right. So I'm a slow developer, and it's taken me a long time to get here. But now I've got here, I want to tell people who are even slower than me, look, don't wait. Do some analysis, join the dots. But the terrifying thing is that in Pope Francis and Cardinal Fernandez, we have people with the power to damage the magisterium, giving us the most dreadful problem as Catholics. To be a Catholic is to believe in papal authority and the magisterium. And almost the worst thing that could happen to a Catholic is to have an abuse of papal authority and an abuse of the magisterium. And one of the things we have to do in my lifetime, and we have to do it now, is to develop a kind of an evolved understanding of authentic and inauthentic magisterium, and I'm afraid an evolved understanding of authentic and inauthentic papal authority. This is such a shock that my trolls tell me, "Who the hell do you think you are, becoming a Catholic and then disbelieving in papal authority?"
Oh, well.
Quite. Well,
I get that. You should see my email inbox as well, because I've been very critical of Pope Francis, and email advice after email advice about how I'm losing my soul, and how can I, as a Catholic, criticize the Pope publicly. Here's part, and I agree with you 100%. One of the greatest theological needs of our time, provoked by this papacy. I know Ed Penton, the canonist, has said, perhaps God has allowed this papacy precisely in order to bring all the toxins and the poisons out, in order to deal with them. That we've now, since the definition of papal infallibility in the late 19th century, right, we've had this issue of what is a relationship between the Pope and authority and bishops. It's been festering for a long time. Okay, so maybe now is the time to deal with it. Along those lines, I will say this. All right, the command that Catholics are to obey the Pope, even in his prudential judgments and so forth. You see this kind of hypertrophy of obedience to the Pope all over the place in various texts, Lumen Gentium 25 and so on. My answer to that is this: none of those admonitions on the part of the church for us to obey the Pope rise to the same level as the Decalogue, as to a commandment in the Ten Commandments. If you look at the Ten Commandments, one of them is honor your father and your mother. Now, honoring your father and your mother is a moral absolute, but one that has to nuance that and say, well, what if my father is beating the crap out of my mother? What if my father is raping my sister? What does honoring my father mean in that context? It means that I call the police on my father. right? That's what it means. It means saying something even perhaps publicly negative in order to out my father. So I would say, okay, we have the Pope. He is our Holy Father. But what is a Catholic to do when our Holy Father becomes an abusive father? Are we then bound to a slavish obedience, even to an abusive father? And my answer is no, we are not. Now we have to unpack what that means theologically downstream. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I wish I could have put it as elegantly as you, but I pursued the same line of argument with slightly different material. But I'm very interested to see that we're exercising the same analytical process. So I would say that in all ethics, you need to get, and as in all philosophy, you need to get as far back to your original presuppositions or proposals as possible, because if you get those wrong, everything then flows badly downstream. And so, in terms, what were they trying to do when those people who said to us, "You must honor the Pope"? They were trying to ensure that the papal office was given the right level of devotion and prominence that our Lord intended. I would say that's the prime virtue. So, in all questions, then we say, well, so that's what we're aiming for, is it? To honor the papal office. Yes, that's why you should honor the Pope. Okay, so now circumstances change and you have a bad Pope. How do I honor the papal office with a bad Pope? Well, you make a distinction between the papal office and the bad Pope. How do we do that? Well, that's fine. So by criticizing Pope Francis, what you and I are trying to do is to maintain exactly the virtue that the people who said obey the Pope intended for us to do. But when they said that, they hadn't conceived of a Pope bringing dishonor on the papal office. It wasn't part of their map at the time. But now we have that. We have to be a little bit light-footed theologically and intellectually and say, how are we going to defend the papal office? And in our time, in our generation, it's to say that the present incumbent is not fulfilling his obligations to the office. Instead, he's imposing upon the office his own sub-Christian predilections. That's a very powerful thing to say, but we've explained why we think they are sub-Christian. We're not just being offensive. If the present holder of the office is imposing upon this sacred office his sub-Christian predilections, we are defending the sacredness of the office by saying so. We may want to watch our attitude. We may want to watch our tone of voice. We may want to say, mea culpa, I am no better myself. But we're not entitled to keep silent, because we're doing exactly what the original people who said obey the Pope intended. We are defending the papal office to the best of our ability.
I could not agree more. That is very eloquently said, which is why in everything, I write a lot in Catholic World Report, National Catholic Register, on my own blog, and I do these videos. One of the things that I often emphasize over and over and over again is that despite my criticisms of this Pope, I do not believe that he has taught formal heresy. I do not believe that he has dragged the papacy into heresy. I don't believe that. I believe that he holds private opinions that might be heretical. I believe that he has set a pastoral course for the church that is disastrous, and might have downstream doctrinal effects that are heretical. But for now, because I had a really great conversation with a priest in Rome, and I won't mention his name, but he's a prominent priest, when I was covering the synod. And I was in Rome, and he said to me, Larry, we have to be very careful of one thing in our criticisms of Pope Francis, and it is this: we have to be sure that there's a papal office left after he's gone.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that we can't be, and we see this amongst certain arch traditionalists, right? The Pope's a heretic. He's teaching formal heresy. He's an anti-Pope. It's sede vacanteism. I think this does enormous damage to the papal office that you and I and others like us are trying to salvage. A Cardinal Mueller, a Cardinal Sarah. Yes. They're not trying to destroy the papal office. They're trying to make the very distinction that you're making here.
And I think that's why I said we need to watch our tone, because it's precisely this level of intense emotional assault that makes it difficult to do what we're setting out to do, and the only justification for what we're doing, which is separating our criticism of the man and the office. If you just get enraged, and it's a perfectly understandable rage, it's the rage of a father who sees his daughter being raped. You know, you just lose it. You're so upset, and you're likely to do dreadful things in your anger. So I'm very sympathetic to the traditionalists who are enraged. I understand why they are, but it would be better if they tried to do what you and I are aspiring to do, which is to not allow people the prospect of confusing our analysis with our sense of righteousness. We have to allow the analysis to carry the righteousness rather than to express it emotionally, or we'll frighten people to the extent where they can't hear what we're saying. And it's very important they should hear what we're saying. I'm a bit more ambiguous about the Pope and heresy. I think when this comes back to, does he know what he's doing? He has trod such a careful line so successfully that I think you didn't get where you are today by not knowing what you're doing or why you're doing it. And I'm afraid I think that increases the likelihood of culpability. I'm not going to say so, but you can't have it both ways. He's either, he's either just sort of drunk too deeply of Peronist Argentinian spirit of confusion, and he's just unfortunately breaking the china in the china shop, or else with a very, very sure touch, and not by himself either, but surrounded by people who are helping him think through this and who have planned the strategy, the timing and the strategy. This is not happening by casual evolution. I think it's being planned, and therefore, because it's too clever, it's too sure-footed.
I agree. He is a Jesuit after all, and I have many good Jesuit friends, but he is a Jesuit after all, and is therefore a master of walking right up to the line without crossing over it. I agree with you. I think this is deliberate. I always tell people who always throw, the Pope splainers, that's the pejorative term that's thrown out there, for people like Mike Lewis and Mike Lofton and guys like this, God bless them. They're doing what they want to do. But they're always throwing back in my face. Well, if you read this in Amoris Laetitia, read this in Fiducia, it can all be explained in a perfectly orthodox way. And I fully concede that, there's a way in which you can completely spin everything this Pope has taught in a formally orthodox way. That's why I say he hasn't taught formal heresy. He's off the hook in that regard. The papacy is intact in terms of the infallibility and indefectibility of the church and all those categories. Nevertheless, I agree with you. My concern is look at not what he says, but what he's done. Who the boots on the ground, personnel is policy. Who has he promoted? Who has he surrounded himself with? What kind of people does he seem to prefer? And the kinds of prelates and priests and so forth that he prefers are the Cardinal Holerichs, the Father Martins, these sorts of people. You begin to see a picture of an incrementalist at work. Somebody who doesn't want to create schism and massive dysfunction overnight, but he wants to slowly change the church by a kind of process of infiltration or osmosis or whatever you want to call it, and so forth. That's why I do think it's important to speak out, to point out, hey, this is what's going on, precisely so we don't get a Francis Part 2.
So you're absolutely right. I love the idea of Francis the incrementalist. I think that should be placed in the public domain as soon as possible, because that's exactly, he is Francis the incrementalist. He knows what he's doing, and he's been Pope long enough to know perfectly well what the effect of his actions are, cumulatively speaking. And at no point has he rode back from them, closed them down, curtailed them, redefined them. He is very happy for them to roll out the way they have done. And therefore, he is an incrementalist. And it's planned and it's deliberate. And my father used to accuse me of this as a child. He said, "You're a very annoying child. I keep on wanting to box your ears and beat you, but somehow you know exactly where the line is. And just as I'm about to raise my hand, you stop. It's you're a very frustrating child to have." And I didn't know I had that gift at the time, but I think Pope Francis has it theologically, and that's what he's doing.
And just the other day is a case in point, right? In the interview on Italian television, where the interviewer says, how does a heavenly Father who loves us all send anybody to hell? And the Pope says, well, in so many words, I get the force of your question, and this isn't dogma. My private opinion is, hopefully, I like to think of hell as empty. Okay, we can debate, my favorite theologian is Hans Urs von Balthasar. I did my dissertation on him.
Right.
So I have a certain sympathy for the idea that I'm not certain I completely agree with it, but I don't think it's heretical to say maybe we should hope for the salvation of everybody after all. But nevertheless, for a pope to say that, I mean, it's just so your point of how clever he is. He goes, okay, we got the dogmas of the church over here. That's what you're complaining about. But my own private views are over here. And so he makes that distinction. Yet it's very subtle. I mean, because he is the Pope saying this, right? Can a Pope say something like that?
So I'd like to argue with you, but only because this is, why not have a theological argument when you can?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I take your point, and it sounds very noble and very compassionate and very good. There are two things I want to say. Well, the first one was about hell, and the second one, oh yes, death. That's right, the death penalty. So I had a very strange but conventional out of the body experience when I was 19. I drank myself to death with a liter of spirits and left my body. I later became a professor of psychology of religion, and I became quite well read on near-death experiences, and they happen to a lot of people a lot of the time. So I'm not suggesting this is anything particularly grace-filled. It's a thing that happened. But a number of things took place. So first of all, there were bits of the Book of Revelation which happened when I went to judgment, and I was judged. And for a 19-year-old who wasn't at all theologically well educated, there were some quite sophisticated moments of insight. It appeared to me that God was plural and singular at the same time, that he was not light, but he was what light came from. How one can make that distinction when you're drunk out of your head or dead, I don't know. But anyway.
Drunk and dead. Okay, drunk and dead.
Well, one or the other or both. But there was a moment when then I don't know why, but the verse "there was silence in heaven for half an hour" came. Wrong context, because of course it's about St. Michael and the fallen angels. But the court of heaven disappeared and withdrew, and I was left suspended in midair and space whilst judgment took place. And I had this very strange thought, which has never left me. If I get sent to hell, I will have the consolation of knowing that there is justice in the universe. Now, I was not a bad 19-year-old. I really hadn't done very much wrong in terms of, I was a sinner, and therefore I'm not entitled to be in the presence of God, not able to withstand the presence of God, which is, I think, partly what hell is. But there's no reason why I should have had a thought like that, except that it seemed to me to be entirely cogent and true. If I get sent to hell, I will have the consolation in hell that justice has been done. And then then the court came back, and I was forgiven and sent back, and I came into my body at about 5 o'clock in the morning. Normally, I can't manage more than 2 pints of beer without my bowels being interrupted. As it happened, I felt better than I'd ever felt in my life. And that's one of the reasons why I think it really happened rather than anything else. But equally, I thought I'd been forgiven. How can I keep this? I know I must forgive everybody else. And I'd got into a fight with a guy who was running the music camp before because he was stealing the money from those of us who were his tutors. And I'd beaten him up in order to persuade him to give us our wages. My colleagues asked me to. I mean, you're the most articulate and pugnacious of all the, would you persuade him? And so I had persuaded him. So the first thing that happened, I thought, I have to forgive him. I waited till he appeared at breakfast, and then I with all the urgency of this near-death experience impelling me, and my gratitude being free from hell, I said, "Ricardo, we have to talk. Come to forgive you." He looked at me and began to walk the other way, and then I ran, so he ran, and I finally caught him up, grabbed him by the lapels, and then an exact repetition of the other. I lifted him off and began to shake him, saying, "I've come to forgive you." He was terrified. But the reason I tell the story is not just because it actually happened that way. But such was the power of what I think I encountered. I've been forgiven. The only way I can keep this is by forgiving other people, even those who've wronged me. And if I go to hell, justice is served. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that we can have any pleasure about human beings who are designed to be children of God, to worship and to adore him, and to receive all the benefits of the blessed sacrifice of the Lamb. There is no satisfaction whatsoever. But there is a complicated complicated alchemy again between justice and love. It defeats most of us. Very few of us are able to theologically or emotionally balance it. And the trouble with what Pope Francis says there is that he entirely destroys any attempt for the rest of us, lower mortals, to gain some sense of that balance. And yet, as we look around, one of the reasons why people don't believe in God is they say, but there is no justice. Look at what human beings do to each other. Our therapeutic culture is crying out for soothing and absolution. But part of our moral crisis is this absence of justice in the face of what human beings do. And the other thing I want to say is that I think he may have committed heresy. And I was very surprised when I saw it. I've found the Catechism of the Catholic Church to be the most marvelous book. I can't believe I've survived this long without it. I just love it. I love what it does, how it's laid out, how it presents itself. And yet the Pope changed it on the death penalty. We have 20 centuries of very clear teaching about the death penalty. He had no right, theologically, to change what the Catechism teaches about the death penalty. Having done that, it allows him a platform for changing the teaching that he had really intended to get to about sexuality. I believe that when he changed the teaching of the Catholic Church on the death penalty, that was heresy. And it was intentional heresy designed to produce other subsequent heresies that are equally important.
I agree. Is maybe slightly. I don't necessarily disagree, but I have a question about that, about the death penalty thing. One of the interesting things to me is, John Paul II, who obviously was opposed to the death penalty, and I think largely as a result of the fact that he lived under two regimes, Nazi and Stalinist, that taught him that it's a very dangerous thing indeed to give the state the power to execute its own.
For sure.
But even he, with that visceral distrust of state power over human life, even he did not change the Catechism of the Catholic Church in that way.
And although I hadn't realized it before, it ties into just what we've been saying, because he was I didn't realize this, I haven't said it before, but I now see it clearly, because he was doing what we should be doing, which was searching for this very, very fine, elusive balance between justice and mercy. Let it be said, I don't want the death penalty either. I would like people to have as long as possible to repent. I hate the idea of the state killing people. But you can't, but the moment you abolish it, or you say it's immoral, you produce this very serious imbalance from which worse things will flow. And the least bad way of managing this conundrum is to keep the justification of the surrender of life. We're back again to amnesia. Most people don't understand the distinction in Hebrew between thou shalt not murder and thou shalt not kill. The Decalogue is thou shalt not murder. It's not thou shalt not kill. And therefore, the state can make a moral case in principle for saying we have the right to take this life at this stage, given what the person's done.
Yeah, the very God who gave those tablets to Moses basically commanded him to wipe out half the people at the base of the mountain when he came down and they were worshiping the golden calf. But anyway, what do you make, though? And I often turn to this. In other words, I'm not disagreeing with you, but saying that maybe possibly this is yet another way where he walks right up to the line but doesn't cross it, where it's very slippery, where he doesn't say that the death penalty is intrinsically evil. He says it is always in all cases inadmissible, which is a strange innovation in the language of moral theology in the Catholic tradition, if you ask me, when applied to something as serious as this. What do you think? This is just a distinction without a difference, or is there any importance to be ascribed to his avoiding the language of intrinsic evil?
Well, I trained in my early years as a lawyer, and occasionally that has some usefulness. Thank goodness, all those years of learning law was a very tedious waste of time. If I was his defense lawyer, I would say that what he had done was to try and change the ideology and the ethics of the church with the minimum amount of stress and strain. In other words, that form of words was intended to create a new principle, but without breaking all the eggs in the basket. And it's done exactly that. Again, if we judge him by the
Yes.
effect, look what it's done. He smuggled this in. He did it in a way that didn't draw attention to itself. Some astute people were very uncomfortable, but it wasn't the language, the event, the subject. It wasn't quite enough, as you say, right up to the line. But it did change it. It changed the meaning.
It did
changed
change the
Catholic
meaning.
teaching.
And it's part of that incrementalism that I was talking about. Now, let's move on to one other thing. I would, if I were to point at this papacy and say, hey, Chapp, can you show one example where you think this Pope really clearly has taught something heretical? I would say the closest he has come, and I have not seen a clarification, is his signature on the Abu Dhabi statement that God has willed the pluralism
absolutely.
of all religions.
Yeah. Yes.
I think it was Bishop Athanasius Schneider who asked him afterwards, you do mean God's permissive will, not direct will, right? And apparently the Pope said, yeah, or something like that. I'll clarify that later, but never did. And Edward Penton has made this point in an interview I did with him. He says, the Pope has clearly taught heresy in his signing of the Abu Dhabi statement. Okay. You bring up the death penalty. I bring up, and Ed Penton brings up the Abu Dhabi statement. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that the Pope then has taught heresy, formal heresy, as Pope in these two occasions. Let's say stipulate to that. Mm-hmm. What does that then do to our theology of the papacy? What then do we do going forward theologically with what you said earlier about developing a kind of a more chastened theology of papal authority?
Well, at this point, I should be overwhelmed by humility and say, "Don't ask me. I'm a new Catholic. What could I possibly bring to the table? Ask some of my older and more learned brothers and sisters." I should say that. I do say that. But at the same time, if you said, "Well, have you had no thoughts about it?" I have had thoughts about it, and they're a bit confused because they require a level of kind of theological and historical imagination that needs to be better informed than mine is. But quite clearly, particularly if you put it within the context of the Eastern Patriarchates, one of the things that we haven't done well in the West is to manage our relations with other apostolic authorities that have a claim to the care of the church. So the Western Patriarch has been a bit brutal with the Eastern Patriarchates. They've been a bit brutal back. We've not managed to solve that. Again, I mean, if you're going to have a synod and anything, having a synod to heal the division between East and West would be, particularly as we discover both politically and spiritually, every time we fail to look after each other in East and West, both evil and, as it happens, Islam do very well out of it. We ought to kind of join the dots again and say, we don't want either evil or Islam to flourish more than they have to, and we can do something about that by setting out to heal the church. But this particular point, I would say that what we're trying to find is some form of rebalancing of papal authority, and what we might do is set it in a wider apostolic context. So clearly we have a number of sources of authority. I think we have to have a renewed epistemology, and I'm not the person to know how that should be done, but it's clearly got to involve the Holy Scriptures and the magisterium and the bishops. It's got to be consistent with conciliar development, and I think it ought to be done with ideally with some form of restoration of apostolic accountability between the patriarchates.
Yes, I agree. What's interesting is I was just reading this morning. This came in the mail yesterday. It's the Louis Bouillet memoirs.
Oh, yes. Wow.
Louis Bouillet, one of my favorite Ressourcement theologians. I love his book on ecclesiology, the Church of God. What is interesting in these memoirs I'm reading, his book, The Church of God, his ecclesiology, came out right at the end of the Second Vatican Council. Mm-hmm. And he says in here, he wishes that maybe the book had come out a little later because there were things that he would have incorporated into this text. But one of the things that comes out in Bouillet's memoirs, very, very interesting, in his reminiscences about the council and so on, he lets slip a couple of lines that are really interesting, where he implies very directly that since the great schism of East and West, that no true ecumenical council is really possible.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a very interesting insight. And it kind of goes to what you're saying here. He's saying, I think, something very similar, that we need to recover a recovery of the fullness of Catholic, with a small c, apostolic authority in the church.
Well, I just agree. I mean, I'm glad he got there first, and I probably read a bit of Bouillet. In fact, I did some postgraduate work with the Jesuits at London University as it happened in the 1980s, which is where I came across him. And I thought, I like this man. This man's good. So I probably picked it up from him in the first place.
Yeah, and he quotes Ratzinger in a few places, and he himself also then. So you think, okay, so he's a conciliarist, or no, he's not. Actually, he really throws a lot of burning coals on the whole idea of the church being run by a big committee of people. And there's a quote from Gregory of Nyssa that he tossed in there about the Council of Constantinople being a gaggle of nitwits, essentially. And so kind of what he's pointing out is, there, as you've just said, there's still an unresolved ecclesiological nuancing of council, pope, other patriarchates, apostolic authority, the epistemology of revelation, scripture, blah, blah, blah. This is still an ongoing process. It doesn't mean that we don't have sure dogmatic markers that we can say this is what it means to be a Christian. But it does mean that there's some developing still, some growing pains that the church is in right now. And so I agree. In other words, I'm agreeing completely with you. I get emails all the time from readers and viewers saying, so Mr. Smarty Pants, since you're critical of the Pope all the time, then what's your theory of papal authority? What's your theory then of, dogmas and certitude and all? Well, it's in flux right now. If I had the answers to all that, I'd be a billionaire. I'd be, living on an island in the South Pacific. I would have,
you'd be Pope.
I'd be Pope or something. They'd crown me in an absentia and say, get over here to Rome. No, I don't want to posture oppose as if I have all the answers, but I do know one thing. I mean, I've studied, and I think you're in the same way. I've studied enough Christian theology, history, philosophy, so on, to know that there's something not right in Rome right now.
Sure.
Something very wrong in Rome right now, and it needs pointing out, regardless of what the downstream effects this might be of our various hyper-papalist theories of, the glories of Rome and so forth. I don't know, just my point of view.
No, I think that's right. But I mean, the wonderful thing about Christianity is that shall we sin that grace may abound? No, certainly not. But every time we sin, grace abounds. So we've screwed up, and the Lord will come to our rescue, and he will take, as long as we get on our knees and we want to repent and try to repent, he will bring good out even out of this mess. It's just that we live at a pretty critical time in human history, or not human history, but the history of our civilization, and the stakes are very high.
And I think that is probably, since we've been at this for about an hour and 45 minutes, that's probably the best way to end. The stakes are very high, and yet where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. Gavin, do you have any last words for the viewers before we sign off?
Oh, yes. What a lovely conversation, Larry. So nice to meet you. I'm sorry we haven't met before, but
I'm sorry we haven't met before either. I've watched a lot of your videos and read your articles. I cannot thank you enough for coming on. And I hope I don't insult any of my other 50 or 60 people that I've interviewed over the past 4 years. But I think this is probably the most fun I've had and the most interesting conversation I've had in any interview I've done so far in my 4 years of doing this. So thank you, Gavin, for coming on for an absolutely fantastic conversation, I thought.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Bye-bye now.